Well, thank you very much, Brock. I'll just start with some opening remarks before my security alert. That does not look good. That looks better. That looks better. I'm going to start by making a few confessions this morning. They say confessions are good for the soul. The first thing is I'm not talking about big data, which is interesting because this year, for the first time, I team taught a course on big data and global cities at the graduate level. I team taught with an industrial engineer, and his job was to teach rapid minor and data analytics and cleaning data and mashups and visualizations. But my job was to do what Matt Turner said, which is to get the students to focus on the big problems and specific problems, and to discuss what some of those policy issues are that big data could lend itself to. But I'm not talking about big data. My second confession is that I'm just getting over the flu. Don't worry, I'm beyond the infectious stage. But my voice may give way at some point during the presentation, for which I apologize. The other effect of just getting over the flu was we were asked to hand in our slide presentations last week, and I was flat out with 103-degree Fahrenheit temperature. And in a haze or a daze or whatever it was, I put together these slides. So they may not work very well. I looked at them this morning. I noticed there's cartoons in them. There's all kinds of things. So I apologize for that if it doesn't work out. So I'm talking about sustainable urban development and municipalities, which I've, my subtext is getting the prices right, and that is the theme of my presentation. Oh, I got there already. Okay. So municipalities in Canada as elsewhere provide a lot of services to people. That's their main role. They provide fire and police protection. They provide water and sewage treatment. They provide roads and transit, waste collection and disposal, planning and development, a list of many different expenditures. And they pay for this largely out of property taxes, which account for about 40% of their revenues on average across the country, user fees about 20–25%, provincial grants, federal grants, and some other miscellaneous revenues. Normally I put up a nice pie chart with all those numbers, but unfortunately Statistics Canada stopped producing this data in 2008. Those numbers are kind of out of date, and although they're coming out with new data shortly, I don't have any up-to-date data to present today. But that gives you a rough idea of where municipalities get their money. So the question is, what can municipalities do to encourage sustainable development? And the answer is they need to price services and infrastructure correctly. How we pay for services as a city affects our behavior. So if we're charging for water, people are going to look at how much water they're consuming. If we charge for waste collection, people are going to look at how much waste they generate. If we pay for these things out of property tax revenues, people will never make those connections. But the way we pay for services also affects where businesses locate, the nature of the development, and the density of the development. If we charge the same for services, whether you locate close to existing services or far away from existing services, people are never going to take that into account in where they locate. So cities have a big role to play just in providing services and paying for them in the way our development will progress. So this idea that pricing services correctly is a good way to go is not a new idea. Ann Dale told me she wrote this in the 1990s in a book. Wilbur Thompson, who's not a psychologist, he's actually an economist, wrote an article in Psychology Today in 1968, and the article is called "The City has a Distorted Price System." And so this is not a new idea. And he argued that incorrect pricing of urban services has been at the root of a number of urban problems, including urban sprawl. So when we use marginal cost pricing and we charge higher fees or taxes for those who are far away from existing services, we will not provide an incentive for sprawl. But if we charge everybody the same, if we use average cost pricing, we will be subsidizing sprawl. So pricing services correctly not only results in the efficient use of the services themselves, the efficient use of water, roads, etc., but also more efficient land use. So it's not, municipalities are strapped for funds. We all know that. Brock referred to the municipal fiscal imbalance. This is not so much about raising revenues. It's more about demand management. It's more about saying, well, do we really need another water treatment plant? I mean, if we priced water correctly and people use the efficient amount of water, maybe we don't need to invest in that infrastructure. So it is a way of bringing in revenue, but it's not, what's more important is that it's reducing demand. So what I want to talk about are a few revenue tools, user fees, and I have some examples from water, waste collection, road pricing, and parking. Parking's already been mentioned. Then I want to talk a bit about property taxes and a bit about development charges or development levies. The first cartoon. So user fees, and what this cartoon says is that, I don't know if you can read it, but over the meter there, it says deposit $1 for green light. And the driver's saying, I see the city's instituting some new user fees to generate more income. So, you don't get to a green light unless you pay the dollar. But that's a bit much, I understand. But user fees signal what people are willing to pay for. In order to implement user fees, of course, you need to be able to identify who the beneficiaries are, and you need to exclude those who don't pay. So we're not going to take every local park and put a fence around it and have a ticket taker. That doesn't make a lot of sense. But user fees are appropriate for water, sewage, garbage collection, highway improvements through tolls, public transit, etc. So getting the prices right in this context means charging user fees that reflect the marginal cost, the additional cost imposed by the user. Why? Then governments know how much of the service to provide, and people know how much it costs, and they incur those costs and make efficient decisions about how much to use. When we don't charge the marginal cost, then people overuse the system. And that's when we say, oh, the roads are congested, we need more roads. That's not the answer. And it also encourages more efficient land use. So economists have been saying this for hundreds of years. And when we look around our cities, we do have user fees, but they're usually very poorly designed. And they're not nearly as high as they could be. Why is that? Well, they're not very popular. People don't like them. People don't like to pay user fees. And even when they do pay user fees, they go crazy when you raise them. The price of milk goes up all the time. The price of theater tickets goes up all the time. But you charge for transit and try and raise that price, and people go crazy. You raise the price of water, people go crazy. So not only do people not like user fees, but they think once they're set by the public sector, they should be frozen at that level. They're not popular with politicians for obvious reasons. They're very visible ways of paying for services. And they're not popular with administrators because they often don't know how to calculate them. It's difficult to calculate marginal costs. It's sometimes difficult to exclude those who don't pay. But here's where the new technology can help. Here's where big data can help. We have a lot of information now on, when you get on a road, with sensors we could find out, how heavy your car is, what time of day is it, how many other cars are there on the road, how fast you're going. I mean, we can get a lot of the information to charge properly that we could never get before. Of course, people always say that user fees aren't fair. Low-income people can't afford to pay for water. We're hurting low-income people. Well, when you think about something like water, who uses more water, a low-income person or a high-income person who has a large lot that they're trying to water, 4 bathrooms, 3 cars they're washing, etc. I mean, when you're subsidizing water, you're subsidizing the rich way more than you're subsidizing the poor. That's not to say we shouldn't have lifeline rates, ways to help low-income people, so with a certain, up to a certain number of meters of water you get for free, and then you pay after that. I mean, there are ways of dealing with this, but this is not an excuse not to price water. 5 minutes left. Oh, thank God. So water is an obvious place to charge user fees. We need to vary them with the time of day, the season, whether it's summer or winter, distance from the source of supply. If we don't price water correctly, we're going to have excess water consumption, produce too much sewage, overinvest in water supply and treatment systems, and we're going to end up with urban sprawl. The problem is we need meters to charge for water, and some of our older cities, like Toronto, people aren't on meters. So, I mean, how are we going to charge the marginal cost if we're not even metering water? Waste collection, again, makes a lot of sense. Landfills are increasingly difficult to find. We have to reduce garbage. When we pay for waste collection out of property taxes, there's no incentive to reduce waste. No incentives for producers to use less packaging. So we need user fees based on volume or weight, so people will reduce, reuse, and recycle. All this makes sense. The last count, only about 200 communities in Canada actually charge user fees for waste collection. So there's an area we need to do a lot more. Road pricing. Again, I don't need to go through all of this with you. When we get into our cars and we get on the highway, we don't look at the external costs. We don't look at the costs of congestion and pollution that we're imposing on others. All we look at is, you know, the wear and tear on our car and gas and insurance and all of that. So we overuse highways relative to what is economically efficient. And we end up with inefficiently low residential densities because people live further and further away because they're not bearing the true cost of being out there. So road tolls make a lot of sense. We can look at London, we can look at Singapore, we can look at Highway 407 in Toronto. The key with road tolls, however, is you need to provide alternatives. The London congestion charge is so successful because before they implemented it, they invested in a major way in bus routes, and so that people had an alternative to taking their car into the city. Again, the technology makes it a lot easier to do. Oops. Parking levies, Matt Kahn already talked about. Donald Shoup, of course, is the main man on parking levies. There's nobody else. He's written books, articles, and basically he says that when you're cruising for a parking space, you're wasting time, fuel, you're creating traffic congestion, accidents, pollution. One study that he did shows that cars cruising for free parking contribute over 8% to total traffic. So again, we have the technology now to do sort of, to vary parking fees with the duration of parking, the location of your parking, the time of day, all kinds of other factors. So let's get away from user fees and briefly talk about the property tax. And that's Snoopy there saying, good grief, I got my property tax bill. Property taxes, as I mentioned, are a major source of revenue across Canada. They're levied on residential, commercial, and industrial properties. And across Canada, they are levied on the market value of property, including the land and the buildings. Some say that property taxes reduce density. You know, any investment that increases your property value, increases the density of the property, will increase the market value and the assessed value, and then increase the tax. Others argue that it increases density because the tax is shifted on to consumers, and they will reduce the size of their homes in response to the tax. So the literature is really kind of mixed on the impact of the property tax on density. But some of the property tax policies we use do affect density. So for example, in a lot of Ontario municipalities, the tax on apartments is much higher than the tax on single-family homes. There's historic reasons for how that came about, and I can explain that later, but it does exist, and that overtaxation of multi-residential buildings obviously discourages density. That's pretty obvious. So the last thing is development levies or development charges. And these are, so when a developer builds a new subdivision, they are responsible for the infrastructure in that subdivision. But what the development charges reflect are the growth-related capital costs outside of the development, so the trunk sewer lines, the roads coming into the development, the costs that the municipality incurs because of the new development. So these are off-site infrastructure costs. And the idea of the development charges is that growth should pay for itself and not be a burden on existing taxpayers. And that makes sense. But developers will development at the efficient time and place if they face the full social cost of their development. So if we differentiate the charge by location, by the density of the development, by the type of development, then we will have efficient development. But if we charge everybody the same amount, we will be subsidizing inefficient land uses. So municipalities have the choice, time is up, municipalities have the choice of calculating all their growth-related capital costs divided by the number of units and charging everybody the same, or they can do it development by development. So if they charge a development close to existing services less, and ones further away more to reflect the true costs, they will have a much more efficient development pattern than if they charge a uniform charge. BC municipalities are very big on differentiating by development. Ontario municipalities less so. So final comments. I've tried to give you some examples of different revenue tools that municipalities have at their disposal and what their impact is on sustainable development. Again, my theme, we need to create the right incentives for sustainable development, pricing services correctly, whether it's through user fees, property taxes, development levies, creates the right incentive both for the efficient use of resources but also for efficient land use and development. Thank you.